Hello, everybody, and welcome to Narrative on a Friday night. It's a special Thanksgiving edition of the show, and we hope wherever you are, you're having a terrific Thanksgiving weekend. Coming up, I talked to Kirby Summers. She's Ghislaine Maxwell's biographer, and her new book exposes some really fascinating details about the woman accused of being Jeffrey Epstein's accomplice. Ghislaine Maxwell's trial begins in New York City this coming Monday, so you don't want to miss this interview because it really sets you up for next week's trial. While I have you, I hope you'll indulge me with a couple of minutes about Narrative's Patron Drive. America and democracy itself has entered its darkest hour. In the coming months and years, we'll be engaging in a global battle over two visions of the future, competing visions, one guided by our common will and self-determination, and another where humans are subject to the whims of a ruler or a dictator. No one can tell you who'll win this clash of ideologies between democracy and autocracy, but what we can tell you is that autocrats are better resourced, they're more organized, and they have a media messaging and influencer network backed by dark money that really puts the Democratic side at real peril. Since 2016, Narrative has been a consistently accurate source of news about this battle of the ages, about this battle between democracy and autocracy. Our exclusive reporting is always way ahead of any other outlet, and we aren't beholden to corporate overlords like everybody else. Our mission is really about the truth, and it's about getting you the truth. We just crossed 1 million downloads of the Narrative podcast, and that number still blows me away. I can't believe how many people are so supportive of the show. Thank you so much for downloading. And that number doesn't even include the many thousands who watch Narrative live every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday when we do the show on Twitter and YouTube. But to beat the autocracy challenge, to beat what's coming at us, Narrative really needs to grow. We need to expand into a network with more shows and more voices, and we can't do it alone. Despite the thousands of people watching, only 1% subscribe to our Patreon program. Without more paying patrons, Narrative's future is in doubt. We really can compete against the autocracy side. If you're already a patron, thank you so much. And we hope you'll consider increasing your monthly subscriptions. And if you're not yet a patron, this is your opportunity to support truthful, independent journalism. It doesn't cost very much. It begins at $5 a month, 40 cents a show, if you will. Plus, we're introducing two new angel investor tiers at $500 and $1,000 a month. After 6 months of contribution, angels will receive a certificate as founders in the Narrative Network. In the $1,000 tier, you'll be included in the Founders Circle. History asks generations like ours, what did you do? By becoming a patron, you'll not only stand up for democracy, you'll empower independent journalism and analysis on the biggest stories of our time. That will help safeguard America's promise for future generations. Despite the autocratic headwinds battling democracy, I remain completely optimistic. You can never underestimate the strength of individuals working together for their common good. It's how the United States was born, and it's how it will continue to succeed going forward. That is our greatest hope. Now, coming up, my interview with Kirby Summers about Ghislaine Maxwell. Hello. Hey friends, thank you for supporting Narrative and our sponsors. What's easier than opening a can of cranberry sauce? Getting free life insurance quotes with Policy Genius, of course. If you're looking for something to do while the family is running a turkey trot, you can be just as productive by comparing quotes from top life insurers with Policy Genius. Why Policy Genius? Well, Policy Genius makes it easy to compare quotes from over a dozen top insurers all in one place. And why compare? Well, you could save 50% or more on life insurance by comparing quotes with Policy Genius. You could save $1,300 or more per year on life insurance by using Policy Genius to compare policies. The licensed experts at Policy Genius work for you, not the insurance companies, so you can trust them to help you navigate every step of the shopping and buying process. That kind of service has earned Policy Genius thousands of 5-star reviews across Trustpilot and Google. And eligible applicants can get covered in as little as a week, thanks to an award-winning policy option that swaps the standard medical exam requirement for a simple phone call. This exclusive policy was recently rated #1 by Forbes Advisor, higher than options from Ladder, Ethos, and Bestow. This is how it works. Getting started is really easy. First, you head to policygenius.com. In a minute, you can work out how much life insurance coverage you need, and from there, you can compare personalized quotes to find out your best price. It's as simple as that. When you're ready to apply, the Policy Genius team will handle the paperwork and scheduling, all for free. Head to policygenius.com to get started right now. Policy Genius. When it comes to insurance, it's nice to get it right. This is the front page from the New York Times on the 6th of November, 1991. And you can see the other story from the Daily News. Robert Maxwell dead at 68. It happened 30 years ago, just last Friday. Quite a monumental piece of history because, as many of you know, we are still facing the remnants of the death, and still a lot of confusion around that death 30 years later. And his daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, stands on trial next week, as soon as next week, when the jury is finally picked for her long-awaited trial. With all of that in mind, I thought it'd be a great idea to bring the one and only Kirby Summers on the show, who's a Ghislaine Maxwell biographer. She's written many books about Epstein. Her latest is called Ghislaine Maxwell, an Unauthorized Biography. And Kirby Summers joins us. Kirby, it's quite monumental, this 30-year anniversary for those of us who follow Robert Maxwell.
100%. First, I want to thank you for having me on, Zev. It's amazing that November is such a crucial month for the life of Robert Maxwell, in the fact that he lost his life, right, on November 5th, 1991. Ghislaine's trial, as you wonderfully pointed out, the grand jury selection will be terminated by the 15th, which is 5 days from today. And her trial begins on November 29th. So I'm sure that this is the last thing anyone in the Maxwell family expected would happen to Ghislaine Maxwell in November, especially, a month that continues to haunt them, I think.
Absolutely, because we still do not know to this day, even though many of us have a very good suspicion, we still don't know officially how he died. I mean, the cause of death is certainly not natural causes. It was something else. He fell off a yacht, which he named after Ghislaine, his beloved yacht, and people suspect that it wasn't quite that. And you go into great detail in your book as to what it might be based on your research and other people's research. And certainly it feels to many people like it was an Israeli intelligence service that may have been involved in the death of Robert Maxwell.
Well, that's certainly what Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon, who co-wrote Robert Maxwell, Israel's super spy, surmised. They sat down and they interviewed Rafi Eitan, who, he is really Israel's super spy, and he was also the handler, not just for Robert Maxwell, but he was the handler for Jonathan Pollard. So they sat down and they have been writing books for a very long time about Mossad history and all of that. And they came away with some documentation indicating that Robert Maxwell had indeed run into financial difficulties toward the end of his life. He was a big spender, as you know. I mean, Ghislaine inherited the same problem. You spend money that you don't have, you move it around, you play around with selling the same stock twice. It's sort of like a little bit of like it's well, let's not call it a little bit. It's very fraudulent what they did. They overextended, they lied on bank applications. And so that he eventually, according again to Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon, went to the Mossad, for whom he was working and had a pretty good relationship. But basically, bottom line, Robert Maxwell was not one to ask someone in a very nice way. It appears that he bullied them and said, if you don't lend me money to get over this hump, which he believed he would get over. Don't forget, like in the 1960s, he went sort of bankrupt for the first time. It took him 5 years to crawl out of that first bankruptcy. And he believed that he would crawl out of this bankruptcy as well. He just needed a little bit of help. The Mossad is thinking, well, wait a minute. He's pushing us around.
Yeah, not a good idea generally to threaten the Mossad or any intelligence agency with any sort of blackmail scheme. It's certainly you can't go to them and say, give me money or else I'll reveal your secrets, because they do have a national security interest at heart. So they 100%. Might do something. They might do something.
So here Robert Maxwell has a lot of secrets, especially about the compromised version of Promise, which he was completely involved with, with the back door selling it to Sandia Laboratories. And, this is a time where the relationship between Israel and the United States is a little bit still challenging, because they're trying to get over the Iran-Contra scandal, where basically Mossad helped the CIA with the providing of arms and all of that. And so there's this relationship that's already a little taut. And for Robert Maxwell to have gone to them instead of like in a position of, hey, guys, do me a favor, he threatened them. And so, according to Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon, again, it was five guys, that went on this little boat. And when his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, on November 5th, sort of entered into the Canary Islands, because he showed he was not feeling good. He was already on the yacht for several days. He was doing fine. He had taken himself they landed in another place. He went and had a very lovely dinner. He followed it with sort of an after dinner drink. And then, he made a few phone calls. He went back to the Lady Ghislaine. He spoke with his son, Ian, and then he spoke with Samuel Pissar, who he had known since, I believe, right after the war. He had been his lifelong friend. And that was sort of like around 10, 11 o'clock at night. And then by 5 o'clock in the morning, nobody can find him. And it's man overboard. He had not one autopsy, but two. During the autopsy that was done, it was discovered, as you probably know, that there was a pulled, he was a very obese man, as everyone knows, that there was a pulled muscle, a lot of it on the part of one of his shoulders. And it implied that he had, whether he was pushed or fell or whatever they thought, that he attempted to hold on, right?
Hmm.
Because like that's what would cause the kind of break that he had.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, so Galen is one of his offspring who never believed it was suicide. She was like, my father would never commit suicide.
Now, all of this reminds me a lot of the way Jeffrey Epstein died, because we never really found out the truth about that either. But there were certainly autopsy results that suggested there was something other than just suicide at play, which is the official reason. And that's because, there's another big echo between these two gentlemen. Certainly, Robert Maxwell was a spy for the Israeli military intelligence, I believe, through my research. That's who I believe he reported to. But so was Jeffrey Epstein a spy for, or at least an asset for the Israeli military intelligence. And both of them meet this sort of untimely end under difficult circumstances. Maxwell blackmailing the intelligence agencies, and Epstein potentially doing similar things because he was just in jail and threatening to also potentially reveal some secrets of his own, because wouldn't that be necessary to get out of jail in that situation? There's a lot
Yes,
of echoes between these two men.
yes. However, while I believe that Jeffrey Epstein was working for Mossad, and in fact, few people know that when he was arrested in Palm Beach, he went on his plane. Typically, when you're arrested, your passport is removed.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, charged when he was initially charged. And it took a long time because, as you know, he had the best attorneys, and they kind of fought back with Alexander Acosta for a while. And so it was a protracted situation. However, Jeffrey Epstein, on the end of May, and I'm trying to remember the year, I believe it was 2008, end of
Probably.
May, he gets on his plane and he goes to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Now, who else goes to Israel at the same time? I just want to, I won't stay too long on this, but I want you to know this. Israel is at this point celebrating their 60th anniversary.
Mm-hmm.
60th anniversary. George Bush is the president. George Bush turns around and he invites Leslie Wexner. Isn't that interesting, to go to Israel at the same time?
That is interesting.
So, yeah, so they're all in Israel at the same time. And Epstein was not going to come back. He really was not. A newspaper article came out and they have it actually attached to Jeffrey Epstein, Predator Spy, which is another one of my books, showing that he checked into the Four Seasons Hotel at Jerusalem, and that he was conducting, I guess, to cover for him, right? That he was conducting some kind of walkthrough through their military base. Now, isn't that an unusual thing for someone who was first, he was supposed to be a real estate like guru, then he was supposed to be a financial guru, and suddenly he is in Israel right before he's supposed to be turning himself into the Palm Beach authorities, looking at the military base of Israel. Well, it seems to me, all right, that because it was the 60th anniversary of Israel becoming an independent state, right, an independent nation by itself, that, and we have Leslie Wexner who's already there, that they sat down and they had a meeting. George, it seems to me it cannot have gone any other way. George Bush sits down with, I forget the name of the prime minister. It could have been her, sir. I don't
Shamir, I'm not
remember.
sure who would have been. Probably Shamir, right?
No, it was not. I
Not
don't think
Shamir.
it was
Sure.
Shamir. No,
Okay.
no.
Okay.
I don't
Well,
think it was, but
2008. Sorry, 2008 would have been. God, just
2008.
yeah. Let me. It'll come to me while you're talking.
It seems to me that they sat down with him and said, "Hey, it's gonna go well. Go back," because it would have that would have brought a lot of attention to Israel. This said, he was also working for the CIA, I've discovered, right? So it wasn't just that he was working for Mossad; he was working also for the CIA.
Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine seem to freelance for a bunch of intelligence assets, intelligence agencies, I should say. They went to the highest bidder in many cases, or what was strategically important for maybe Israel or the United States at the time. So it's interesting that they all have ties to all these intelligence agencies. And yet somehow, this is open secret, I would say, for 30 years. And yet we're still facing a court case right now that Ghislaine Maxwell is going to go in front of a court, and no one knows for sure what her status is in terms of this intelligence agencies. The court cases presumably are going to be specifically about the allegations made against her. And yet there's a bigger reason maybe that all these things happened, that her cases and her crimes, alleged crimes took place, that they're, were maybe following orders from intelligence agencies. And I don't know if we're going to ever find out the truth about that. Do you?
Well, I can tell you 100%, we're never going to be told. I mean, Alexander Acosta, when he made that statement, I was told to back off, that Epstein belonged to intelligence. He was in the middle, he had prepared, I believe it was a 50-page indictment against Epstein that would have put him in jail for a very long time, when he was approached by his superiors in the United States government and basically told to back off. Epstein, if you remember, when he was in Palm Beach, was treated very leniently. He was put into a separate jail, which was empty. He didn't have to lock his door. He was allowed to rent an office. He gave it some kind of name with the word scientific in it, where he would go every day for a total of 12 hours, with the exception of Sunday. He had his own bodyguards, his own driver, his he had, people pick him up, and he had everybody visit him. Jean-Luc Brunel, Nadia Marcinko, who he told everyone was his sex slave that he had gotten from Yugoslavia, visit him on a regular basis, and he visited elsewhere on a regular basis. Instead of doing the 18 months that he was supposed to do, he only served 13. Instead of being on afterwards, there's a period for at least a year that you're supposed to be under house arrest. Epstein was already on his plane, flying wherever he wanted. One of the attorneys in Palm Beach hired a private detective to tail him, so that if he were to, let's say, not follow what the rules were post being allowed out, that they could rearrest him. Well, he would call his probation officer, "Hey, I just saw Jeffrey Epstein here. He's in violation of parole." And nobody did anything. So Epstein was very much protected. He was not as lucky in 2019, but we can talk about that if you want. And I have my own suspicions as to why Ghislaine and Maxwell were frankly arrested.
Well, let's talk about that, because it is, we don't have a lot of time here, but it is interesting that, he got away so easily in 2008. Certainly Maxwell never faced any courts for the things that he did. Yet Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein Jeffrey Epstein was about to face the judicial system. Now Ghislaine Maxwell is doing that. What has changed?
Well, I think that the public discourse tends to favor one avenue, and I tend to favor a second one. So the public discourse, let's say on social media, right, tends to favor the fact Julie K. Brown, who an esteemed journalist for the Miami Herald, wrote these articles commencing in 2018, bringing to light Jeffrey Epstein. And by the way, it did bother him. He's a PR guy, he spoke with Stephen Bannon. He wanted Stephen Bannon to help him get maybe on television shows so that he can resurrect his image, because Julie Brown was, again, kind of messing up his world. But he never in a million years believed that anything would happen to him. So, but the consensus, let's say, the internet sleuths, if you will call them, is that he was rearrested based on Julie Brown's work, based on the fact that, yes, we're being more vocal on social media. I tend to look at it a little differently. And in fact, I am happy that there's a book now written by, let me get this guy's name, which supports my feeling. If you just give me a second, I will
While you do
find.
that, it was Olmert, I think, was the prime minister of Israel in 2008. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
there was going to be a second presidential campaign, right? He believed that Donald Trump was concerned of having Jeffrey Epstein out there with the kind of information that he may have had on him, and he wanted to make sure that he was silent. Michael Wolff has written a book. Basically, he writes exactly the way I looked at it, and the same for Ghislaine. He even writes in his book, Wolff, that Donald Trump approached someone and wanted to know, hey, and I think this made mainstream media, what has Ghislaine Maxwell said about me? Has she, he was like very curious. Is she talking about me? What does she say? It's like, it's kind of like, and then he also goes on to solidify what we were all surmising right before Donald Trump's last day in office. Is he going to give Ghislaine Maxwell a preemptive pardon? And the answer is he was. Why he didn't do it, I don't know what convinced him. Maybe it would have made him look guilty, right?
I
If
think
he
that
had
was the
given her.
concern at the end. If I recall correctly, that's what people were saying to him, that, any sort of pardons would have made him look very complicit. So, certainly would have interested many journalists in terms of investigating it further. I'm of two minds of it. I don't know independently, even under Bill Barr and others, the judicial system was really working at the time. So it's quite plausible that it wasn't for any particular political reason that they were arresting him. Or maybe there was a political reason, but it's not the one you're stating there. Maybe it was the one to, if they have Ghislaine Maxwell or Jeffrey Epstein in custody, they have leverage over Donald Trump, which at that time they were just beginning to realize Trump was, potentially a Russian asset himself and had been, compromised in some ways. It would have been useful for them to have Ghislaine or Jeffrey in custody as a form of leverage against that. But, there's no evidence around that. That's just my complete speculation.
So here's what I usually try to explain to people who follow me on Twitter. This is not a lone trafficking ring that began with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. This existed before with Roy Cohn. He had a child trafficking ring. This existed with the Franklin scandal, which was also connected to the Roy Cohn. So it seems to be a second generation. At least that is what it looks like to us, right? That it's a second generation spy family.
It sure does. And, what's interesting for me is that, I look at the Robert Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein, I'm going to call it a handover, because that's what it really looks like to me, is a handover, that it was an orchestrated plan to, on the one hand, make it look like Robert Maxwell was deeply indebted. We don't know where that money went. He was, was talking about millions of dollars in pension funds and other things that disappeared. Maybe, just maybe, that money landed up as part of Jeffrey Epstein's.
Jeffrey Epstein, I believe, was already connected to intelligence since the time of the 1980s, and I detail that in Jeffrey Epstein, Predator Spy, and in some of my other books. And there are definite connections that can be traced through court documents, through different things. I'm not just surmising. Right.
My own research differs from yours on that, because I do think that, and two people went on the record with me to say that Epstein and Ghislaine did meet in the 1980s when he was involved in in weapons and arms trading as part of the Al Yamana deal. And at that point, that Robert Maxwell took a bit of a shining to him as a potential future husband to Ghislaine Maxwell, so they say, and even tried to bring him on board the Iran-Contra team. And then Ari Ben Menashe claims that he scuttled that. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's his words. And it seems that, Steve Hoffenberg has told me the same thing, that they met prior to them arriving in the United States, to her arrival in the United States, that they'd met in the 1980s and then had a love affair that started early on.
That's why it was important for me to fill in the years 1986 to 1990 and even to 1991. And when I went down that rabbit hole, she was very much in love with Count Gianfranco. And once he left her for like a another woman, she was photographed with several men, one of them being George Hamilton. He used to date Elizabeth Taylor. He has a suntan around, year round. She was photographed with all of these men. Every woman, if she is left by a lover that she really is in love with, especially if you're in the public eye, you're going to make sure that photographs appear of you on the arm of very eligible and very desirable men, which is what she did. At no time in the 1990s, when she was being photographed at all of these events intentionally with all of these men, including one of the Kennedys, was Epstein around. Epstein showed up as a shadow in 1992. He was almost photographed boarding the Concorde when Ghislaine decided she got tired of hiding under a blonde wig after her father's fraud was exposed. They were harassing the family, and the people just completely hated them, and she couldn't handle it. So she got tired of being in London. She had already been exposed to New York City because Maxwell, as you know, purchased the Daily News, I believe, in 1989. And so she had already been coming to New York. She enjoyed it. One of her best friends was Yvonne, who was already divorced from Donald Trump. And so she enjoyed the life here. She decided to make this her home. In my book, I explained that it is my belief, and it has been confirmed through a newspaper source that I was able to find of the time, that Ghislaine, when she was on the Lady Ghislaine, after her father was pushed or fell off his yacht, there are two mainstream media reports stating that she was throwing everything in her father's office. She was going through all of the paperwork,
Shredding things, I
and
believe.
shredding things. And yes, so you read the same thing, but that she had, I believe, during the time that she was going through documents. And in my book, I also go into how Robert Maxwell trained her to be a spy. He pretty much took her under his wing. He introduced her to the presidents of the United States. He introduced her to the heads of country. He took her to Israel. He didn't really do that with any of his other children,
No,
right?
no.
But he did it with her. So she took control and she went over his documents. And I believe it was at that time that she picked up Epstein's information, called him. And that is why when she came to New York with her mother for the YIVO affair to honor her father, that he accompanied her. And that's where we see the photograph and the beginning of their collaboration.
It's interesting to me that she was trained by her father, and it's also interesting that we saw a continuation of the work. Really, it was not over once he died. She obviously remained an asset of some sort to the military intelligence in Israel, and so did Jeffrey Epstein, because that appears to be what they were doing throughout that period of time where they were running these operations. And how you perceive the Prince Andrew's role in all of this? We are, led to believe by so many people that this is some sort of op, that he's been set up or something like that. Yet there's no evidence of any of that. It does seem to me like the case as it's been represented by Virginia Giuffre is pretty accurate in terms of how they met and what happened, and also his involvement in getting Jeffrey Epstein off in 2008.
Yeah, with Bill Clinton.
It's interesting, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, 100%. They're trying to make Virginia Giuffre look bad. It's really interesting. Prince Andrew is either, there are some people who are like just deaf to the reality of life and who are just, doesn't matter if the reality is looking at them straight in the eye, they are kind of, I don't know, they're tone deaf. And when he did that BBC interview, which landed like a thud
Absolutely.
with everybody else, he seemed unfazed by it, right? And so when the world has now, thank goodness, finally rallied around Virginia Giuffre, understands a little bit more about human trafficking and about what happens. You're not held by physical restraints. He should have just quietly settled. He's already been completely destroyed, I believe, for the rest of his life. There's no coming back. But for him to allow this attorney and to put forth a notion that Virginia Giuffre is a money-hungry sex kitten, that doesn't look good for him. She's already proven herself who she is. She doesn't have to prove to anybody else what happened to her. She's a victim, and she's the most bravest one, right? She's the one who has stepped forward. She has named everyone. The public would not know that much had she not taken Ghislaine Maxwell to court, had she not sued Epstein. But Prince Andrew seems to not know how to control his behavior. So he has once again called her, a horrific thing. And it just shows the fact that he is, in everybody's opinion, it corroborate her allegations. Yes, he was probably inappropriate with her, because why else would he be with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell pretty much for well over a decade, that's documented in mainstream media, if it weren't for the fact that they could supply him with an endless stream of young girls, which they did.
And that is a good question. And we're going to leave it at that question, because I think there's probably other reasons too that we don't know yet that could have involved Andrew, and that might be involvement in arms to many other things that may have involved the royal family in general. That's one of the things that they do get involved in. So this has been a fascinating conversation, Kirby, and I'm sure you and I could talk hours and hours about Ghislaine Maxwell and about Robert Maxwell and about Jeffrey Epstein. I hope we get another opportunity in the near future, because the trial does begin. So what's your expectation of this trial? Just as to wrap up here, the last question. And also, why should people read your book?
Well, they should read my book because I go where mainstream media is afraid to go or cannot go. So the book has a lot of information you really won't find anywhere else. It's called Ghislaine Maxwell, an unauthorized biography. It's on my website, kirbysummers.com, but it's also available on Amazon, in Kindle, and in paperback. The sequel is Ghislaine Maxwell Blackmail, and I take her from age 30 to present day in that book, and that'll be available in a few months. The trial, while the public is really watching this carefully and they really wish for a resolution, it's only 4 victims and for a very limited amount of time. I hope for them too, but hope does not, as you know, make the right thing happen. So because Ghislaine really is an espionage case. That's really the crux of it. And the court is going to do anything in their power to keep that from happening. The first step was denying their ability to bring up during the case Jeffrey Epstein's non-prosecution agreement, which is like, if you bring that up, that opens the door to intelligence and opens the door to the naming of very prominent men, right? The most powerful men in the world. So they have denied her that ability. I don't expect much. She's already playing the sick card. They're saying that if she is not released from jail, that she's going to be too frail to attend her own court case. So let's see what happens. There's a lot more that's going to happen between now and November 29th.
For sure. I agree with you. Lots more still to come. It could be that maybe they just want to set the record straight. Maybe this is one way of doing it. It certainly seems like 30 years of secrets and lies and manipulation and influence on every level of government and globally, and it has really not led the world to a safe place. Maybe there's a realization now that we should probably come clean on some of the things that have happened in the last 30 years so America can heal and move on. That's the hopeful thought that I have, just to leave us tonight, because I do think that if you can't look at the last 30 years and not include Robert Maxwell in that conversation because he was so pivotal, and to a lesser extent, but still very important, Epstein and Ghislaine. So, what was that operation all about? Why such a massive operation and for so long? We need to sort of understand it, and maybe this is an opportunity in front of a judge to be able to do that. Kirby
Well,
Summers.
I hope you're right.
I
Thank you
hope
for
so
having
too.
me on, Steph.
It's not the kind of case you normally would see in front of a court. It's normally in the realm of counterintelligence. This is not the kind of stuff that they bring up in court.
Well, I mean, but that's the point. That's my point.
Yeah.
This is not about intelligence. They're have narrowed this down to sexual assault and transportation of minors across interstate lines. So this is a very narrow case. I do not believe the government has a strong case. I believe it's intentional. If you look at the history of everyone involved in this case on a higher up level, you will, I mean, you'll look at it a little bit with more skepticism, I believe.
Well, I don't think they're going to come clean about everything, to be honest. But I think they'll come clean on some things. Which maybe if it's just a start. Maybe, we saw it at 9/11. We saw some of the FBI documents being declassified. That I think was a good move. Maybe this is another step in that direction. The book is called Ghislaine Maxwell, an unauthorized biography. It's by Kirby Summers. You can get it on her website. You've seen the cover throughout the show. And Kirby's writing another book. So get ready for that. Ghislaine Maxwell Blackmail, which is interesting and exciting. And hopefully we'll have you back on the show, Kirby. It's always great to talk to you. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We'll be watching the trial with you. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens. I can't believe it starts this month.
I know, it's crazy. Well, thanks again, Zev. Have a good day. Talk soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Narrative is made possible by viewers like you. Join today and support truly independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. That's patreon.com/narrative.